It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman. I'd like to welcome back to the show Maria Johnson, here to talk about her newest book, Our Lady of Charity, How a Cuban Devotion to Mary Helped Me Grow in Faith and Love. Thanks for being here, Maria.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Hi, guys.
Hey. So, Maria, Mary has many titles. Where does the title of Our Lady of Charity come from?
Well, it's actually a title of Mary that originated in Cuba in the early 1600s. And it's not an apparition of Mary. Sometimes people get a little confused about that. But it was an incident where three young men, two Native American Cubans, maybe a Taino, and a young African boy, went out into the Bay of Nipe to gather salt in the salt marshes. And a storm came up in the bay. And they were terrified, and because of the Spanish colonization in Cuba, they had been catechized, and they turned to the Blessed Mother for succor, for help, and they called out to her to intercede for them. And sure as rain, boom, the storm stopped, and the waters were calm. And when they looked down into the water, they saw something floating next to the boat, kind of, lapping up against the canoe that they were in. And when they pulled it out of the water, what they found was a statue of Mary that was tied to this board. And on the board it said, "I'm the Virgin of Charity." But the amazing thing about the statue is that it wasn't wet, and it had been in the water. And so they immediately took that as a sign from Mary, a little wink. I heard you, and I asked my son to help. And so they took the statue back to their little town, and they built the first shrine in this little village of Barajawa. And they started venerating Mary in that little shrine. And the devotion grew, and eventually it was so huge in that area that it had made it down to the copper mines where the Indians worked and where the African slaves were brought to work. And the devotion really became like this magnificent identity for the people of the area. And so the church brought the statue into the cathedral for everyone to venerate, and just took off from there.
Yeah. There are parts of the story, obviously lots of differences, but parts of the story remind me of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And Our Lady of Guadalupe has obviously become world famous and is credited for a lot of the conversions that happened in Mexico. Did Our Lady of Charity spawn a lot of conversions in Cuba or even beyond?
Oh, yeah. And as a matter of fact, she was like the people's Virgencita, little virgin, they called her, because the statue was wood and the face was made of clay. And so you could really project whatever image of the Blessed Mother you wanted onto her. So she looked like all of our mother. And so it became very beautiful. And in fact, the lovely story of this 400-year tradition in Cuba is a few years before the 400th anniversary of the finding of the statue. There was a special edict for the Catholic Church to have processions. There were Eucharistic processions throughout Cuba that lasted the 2 or 3 years leading up to the 400th Jubilee year, where they took the statue out for all of the Cuban people to see it, because they couldn't make a pilgrimage to the Basilica in Santiago, in El Cobre, actually. And, wherever Mary goes, she leads you to her son. So they kind of took advantage of that. And the Blessed Sacrament made this trip around Cuba. So isn't that a magnificent, today in a communist regime, this happened.
Yeah.
And so Mary has never, left the Cuban people.
So you moved from Cuba to the United States when you were very young. Do you have many memories of devotion to Our Lady from your childhood in Cuba?
Not in Cuba, but certainly I came to the United States when I was turning 3. I was still 2. But, through my parents' devotion, when kids grow up with images of the Blessed Mother in their homes, it's usually, maybe Our Lady of Grace, or maybe a depiction from a nativity scene. But I grew up with Our Lady of Charity, which was the devotion that my parents had. In fact, my dad's middle name is Caridad. He was named after Our Lady of Charity, his middle name.
Is that a common name or middle name?
Yes, it's Vicente de la Caridad, so it's Vincent of Our Lady of Charity. Was
I like
his
that.
birth name. Yeah, he went by Alex, but that was his birth name.
So how has Mary been a part of your faith since then?
Well, I think that for a long period of time, especially after I went to Catholic school and high school and even into adulthood, it's not that I forgot the devotion to Our Lady of Charity, but because of the way that I was raised in the United States, I also saw other titles of Mary. And so she wasn't really at the forefront until about 2015. In the fall, I was able to go back to Cuba during Pope Francis's apostolic visit, right before the meeting of families here in the United States. And I actually went on a pilgrimage to the Basilica. I don't want to say re-encountered her, but encountered her in a richer, fuller way.
You talk about our past three popes and their visits to Cuba, as well as their devotion to Mary. Can you share a little bit about what that means to you?
Oh, it was so beautiful to have witnessed their presence in the Basilica, especially St. John Paul II's. When we went to Cuba, we went with a religious visa for pilgrimage. And I have a kind of little advantage in that my uncle is the bishop of Holguin, where the Bay of Nipe is, where the first, where the statue was found. And so we had a little bit of a hookup in the Basilica, and immediately following the Mass that Pope Francis celebrated and he left the country, we were able to have a private tour of the Basilica. And I was traveling with my mother and her two sisters, and then, of course, met my two uncles, the bishop and another brother in Cuba. So we were able to be on the altar where the statue had been brought down for Pope Francis, because he has his tradition of always greeting the Blessed Mother with flowers. And so we were there, and the flowers were still there on the altar, and I was able to see the gifts that St. John Paul II had taken, the rose and a beautiful crown and the golden flower. I think it was from Pope Benedict, and this beautiful silver urn with gold flowers in it from Pope Francis. So it was really nice to see the physical signs of their devotion. But, my gentle signs were the only thing I could offer at that moment was a copy of one of my books that I happened to be carrying. So I left that there for Our Lady. But it really reminded me of our innocence as children, because I remember taking my own tiny children when they were toddlers and a little older, to Mary crownings at our church, or even just on a Saturday afternoon. And they would pick little dandelions or pull out their sticker book and give her a sticker, little gifts that little children give to their moms, and that I was able to pass on to them this idea of giving little treats to Mary too.
Mm-hmm. We're talking with Maria Johnson. The book is Our Lady of Charity, How a Cuban Devotion to Mary Helped Me Grow in Faith and Love. And in the book, you refer to yourself as part of a sandwich generation of immigrants regarding the two countries. And you said, quote, living in both and belonging to neither. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's really, I think it really speaks to the human condition. I felt very deeply my parents' feelings of exile when they left Cuba. They were very young and just, starting a family, and their feeling of isolation from everything they knew, from the language, from the culture, from family, because they came alone. And so, I kind of grew up with that sense of isolation, of always being a part of something, but not quite fully. I didn't feel 100% American, because we spoke Spanish at home, and our food was different, and our customs were different. I mean, I tell funny stories. For example, I had chaperones when I dated in high school. My mother accompanied me on a date. And I think I might have said something about that in the book, but our customs were different, and so I never really felt that I belonged. But then I was so Americanized. I preferred to speak English. I preferred the American customs. I was always fighting the chaperone situation. So I wasn't really quite Cuban enough for the Cuban family. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I was never enough of either. And I think that speaks to the exile that we have on earth. We're really not from here. We're really meant to be in paradise, in heaven. And so that gave me a really deep connection to the faith. Once as a mature adult, I was able to really reconcile what that means. And I don't often feel that way anymore. I think I embrace both of my cultures fully now, but it was tough growing up like that, being, part of two different worlds and not really in either.
Yeah. Another thing you talk about is how sometimes Jesus leads us to Mary and sometimes Mary leads us to Jesus. And for you, it was the latter. So how did Mary lead you to Jesus?
Well, I think that if you look at the image of Our Lady of Charity, she's holding the infant Jesus in her left arm, under her heart, and he's the Incarnation. But in her other arm, in her other hand, she's holding the cross. So it's a foreshadowing of his passion. And so I saw this image my whole life, even before I understood fully what she was holding in both her arms. And so to have this relationship with Mary is really to contemplate her, particularly in this image, is also to contemplate Christ. And so, it took me a long time. In fact, it took me 2 decades to complete a consecration to Jesus through Mary. I tried and failed several times before I finally hit it and was successful.
Very dedicated.
And I think that's pretty common.
Yeah.
But really, it really did bring me closer to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the infant in one arm and the cross in the other, symbolizing both the Incarnation and the Crucifixion. And I think you said that this is the only image that has both of those and shows this kind of entirety of Christ's life on earth. Is that true?
As far as I can tell, I've been doing quite a bit of research on this over the years, and I've never really seen another image like that. Now, there is a Virgin of Charity in the Philippines, and she's a little different. So I don't know. Some of the history books say that perhaps this is a devotion that kind of grew from maybe Our Lady of Illescas in Spain, but I really haven't seen it, and I would absolutely welcome information if any of your listeners have any. Images of Mary that also show the cross. But so far in my research, she's the only one.
That's great. Well, such a great book. It's half history lesson, half memoir, and a great introduction to Our Lady of Charity. So thanks so much for sharing it with us today. How can people get a copy of it?
Oh, I always ask you to go to your local bookstores first, but you can get it straight from the publisher, AveMariaPress.com, or I'm pretty sure that Amazon is running for a reduced price right now, or you can find it also at Barnes & Noble.
All right, again, Our Lady of Charity, How a Cuban Devotion to Mary Helped Me Grow in Faith and Love. Thank you so much, Maria Johnson, for sharing with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, always a pleasure. Thanks.